So the title of my presentation is A Science and Contemplative Perspective on Well-Being, because as I will hopefully tell you, when we control mental chaos, the outcome is well-being, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the emphasis on well-being. But I want to start out by telling you a little bit about myself. You've already heard, but I want to reiterate my connection with cognitive science, because I don't know how many of you know what cognitive science is, but it's the study of intelligent behavior, whether it's human, animal, or computers. And today was a good day for cognitive science because one of our own, Geoffrey Hinton, received a Nobel Prize in physics. He's considered the godfather of AI, of artificial intelligence. And so, yay, cognitive science. But one of the things about cognitive science is that it's a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach to the study of intelligence, because intelligence is such a complicated topic that you need to come at it from different perspectives. And so for the purposes of this talk, I just want to tell you that my interests focus primarily in psychology, the psychological sort of background of the mind, neuroscience, and contemplative practices. So for 30 years, I did all those things, studied psychology, studied neuroscience, and then studied contemplative practices. The contemplative practices was really a focus on mindfulness meditation practice. And so the way I look at it, science provided me with a very objective view of what the mind is about. What is the neuroscience and the neurochemistry and the neurobiology of mind? What is it? What is the brain? How does it relate to mind? But the contemplative practices gave me more of a subjective view, a first-person sort of account of those mind things that I was interested in, right? And so what happened was that at the end of 30 years of doing those studies, I decided that I had learned some things, a few things about the mind, and I wanted to share it with individuals. I wanted to share the knowledge that I had come across. And it's really, so this book, Controlling Mental Chaos, it's really my take on what we would think of as the cause of most mental suffering. And I don't say that. It's been said many times for thousands of years that the main cause of mental pain and mental suffering is the fact that we have a mind. It's an amazing mind, but it's uncontrolled, right? Some people call it the monkey mind because it does what it wants to do and sometimes what you don't want it to do, right? The brain mind is really probably the most sophisticated organism that we know of in the universe. And unfortunately, it doesn't come with an owner's manual, right? It doesn't come with, here's how you use it, here's how you develop these skills, et cetera. We're left to find out about this really highly sophisticated thing on our own. And most of the time, we mess it up, right? And so, when I was, after 30 years of studying, well, not the 30 years, but after 5 years of working on this book, I wanted to address that issue, and I wanted to get to what E. Cummings said about the root of the root and the secret of life that nobody knows. This is from a beautiful poem that he wrote. But when I was writing the book, I felt that I was trying to get at what is the root of the problem, right? Because there are many, very intelligent individuals who have come up with all sorts of explanations for the problems of humankind, the problems of the mind, and in many ways to address them. And a lot of them work. So, but I wanted to get to what is it that we can get to and that it's easy to address, right? Is there such a thing? So I wanted to share that in the book, and I want to share that with you today. Right? So I want to begin with the bad news. Always the bad news first. So the bad news is that many surveys have been done asking people, is there a mental crisis in the US especially? Are people suffering from some sort of mental crises? And when 90% of respondents say, yes, there's something going on. I'm feeling so overwhelmed all the time that, you know, and other people that I talk to are feeling overwhelmed by all the problems that they're facing, all the problems of the world, the wars and political instability, and, you know, my kid's not doing well and my health is going bad, you know, et cetera. I just feel overwhelmed. You know, so there is something going on. So what I wanted to tell you is that this chaos is real based on what people report, right? They feel something and it's happening to them. But what do we mean? You know, what does it mean? What am I talking about when I say mental chaos? And so there are a number of other terms that you can associate with that mental chaos. This feeling of being overwhelmed, just too much stuff coming at me. A feeling of disorder. You feel disoriented. There's anxiety that comes up, restlessness, fear, confusion. And if I ask you, you know, what is your favorite term for the mental chaos that you might be experiencing or that you think people are experiencing, we can come up with a whole list of things, right? And well, let me ask you, how would you characterize the mental chaos that's going on maybe in your life or in the life of people that you know? What would be another word that you would use to characterize that? Yeah. Fear? Okay. Uncertainty?
Oh, fear's up there.
Yeah.
Distraction.
Distraction? Okay.
Rumination.
Rumination. I mean, really, literally, we could go on all night and we would come up with a whole bunch of terms describing this thing. But what I want to do, though, is be careful about what we're really talking about here and tell you that, in fact, what 80 to 90% of us experience is not really the kind of chaos that people think of initially, which is, so this over here on the right side is a normal distribution of people experiencing this state. And what I've tried to show is that there is, in fact, if you're on the far right end of that spectrum and you're experiencing what I call true mental chaos, which is the chaos where 24/7 you're ruminating, you're overwhelmed, you're distracted, you're anxious, and it's affecting your life. You can't really function because you're just in that state all the time. That's a state of disorder that I would call maybe schizophrenia or obsessive compulsive disorder. So on the far right of the spectrum are those individuals, and you know they need a specific kind of help. Most of us, I would say, fall in the middle category that I would call healthy problematic, right? Healthy problematic is really more of a state of confusion where temporarily you're in a state of confusion, a state of uncertainty. Psychologists call it a liminal state, a state of not knowing. And it's defined by the following, where you're trying to solve a problem, something comes up in your life, you're trying to solve it, but there are just too many factors to consider and you can't get to the answer, right? And so your mind spins and spins and spins and you just can't get to the answer. And so what I would say is that problem solving, which is the approach that most of us apply to problems, doesn't work, right? Problem solving doesn't work in a lot of cases. Okay. Now, I asked you, how do you characterize your state of confusion? And when I ask when I give these kinds of talks and I ask people about that, one of the things that always comes up regularly are these terms: disembodied, discombobulated, dissociated self, right? How many can identify with that? That you're so, you're so much in this state of confusion that you dissociate sometimes. So one of the metaphors that I like is a story by James Joyce, who described Mr. Duffy as someone who lived a short distance from his body. And it's kind of like the perfect metaphor for how I describe this state. So we're like in that guy on the right side there, where your body is here, but your mind is so engaged in things, it's dissociated from your body, and you're over here thinking, trying to run through all the problems that you have in life, and your body is over here, right? So you've sort of dissociated. As I will come back to in a bit, that by itself, it's a huge problem, okay? Being dissociated from your body and not listening to the signals that your body is trying to tell you. Okay. Where does all this come from? What causes this unhealthy, troubled mind? And of course, we can think about all the triggers that trigger you. We have our own specific triggers, but it could be the problems you're having at home, the kids not doing well. I went through a whole list of other things. The climate crises, the hurricanes, the political instability, all these things are sort of hitting us all at once, and we feel overwhelmed. And you add to that technology, wonderful technology that we have, which, what does this technology do? I mean, it's a wonderful thing, right, to have, but it also connects us with the world's problems, right? You turn it on and there's the Middle East and the wars. You turn it on, there's Africa and the hunger crises and so on, right? And so suddenly you're faced with not only the problems that you have at home in your social group, but now you have the world's problems in your hand. And again, this feeling of just being overwhelmed comes over you, right? So I'm sure you can identify with all that, hopefully. So that's the bad news. Here's the good news that I talk about in the book. So the good news is that there's something you can do to manage this a lot better. And the way I describe it is, it's a complementary approach to the problem-solving mind, right? But it's a mind that we rarely tune to, exercise, encourage, etc. And it's what has been called the mindfulness, open awareness mind, where instead of focusing on a problem and trying to solve it, you sort of step back and you look at the big picture, or you look at the sunset and you just simply enjoy the sunset, right? That kind of mind is what I'm talking about when I say open awareness. And what happens when you practice that kind of mind, you begin to realize that there are moments where you're suddenly here, right? You're living in the present instead of the past or the future, right? And so, as I'll come to in a bit, this complementary mind allows us to look at problems in a different way, find solutions in a different way, okay? So that's the idea. And here's the part of the argument. Psychologists recognize that the last thing that you want to do when you're in a state of confusion, when you're in the state of, spinning, the last thing you need to do is keep spinning, right? What you want to do is pause. So there's what they call the power of pause, is to simply say, okay, enough of that. I'm going to rest, take a break from that, go over here, watch the sunset, listen to music, do a little bit of dancing, or just simply sit and relax, and then maybe come back to the problem. But that gives you an opportunity to do a number of things, as I'll come to. And so what exactly is this sort of power of pause? First thing is you stop doing whatever it is your mind is doing. You kind of stop and say, okay, enough of that. I'm not going to solve the problem. You sort of quiet down your mind a little bit. You relax, you try to relax, you take a breath. But then more than that, as you get into the practice of doing that, part of what the practice is, you hold that state with a kind of kindness and open awareness. You open your heart to it, right? So it's like, again, when you're looking at a beautiful sunset, your heart sort of warms up to that beautiful sunset. Kind of the same idea, right? So you're here facing a problem, you stop, you look at it, you develop this sort of warmth towards that problem, and then you simply listen to that, whatever is going on. You don't try to solve anything, you simply listen. So this is what I mean by mindfulness. Everybody can do it. Is anybody here not able to do that? Simply pause and take a look at what's going on in your mind, right? So just for now, just take a moment and sit and relax and think about what you're doing at this moment. You're here in this room listening to a lecture, maybe you're uncomfortable, maybe, whatever, but instead of being judgmental about things, just simply observe that, right? And that's the idea. Mindfulness is simply taking a look at what's going on in your mind, simply observing what's going on without judgment. Okay. When you take an individual who's doing that kind of mindfulness, awareness, meditation, and you put them in an fMR scanner, and you look at the brain areas that are activated, there's a whole series of areas. So this is a study from Tang et al., 2015, where they did that. They took individuals, they said, okay, do mindfulness meditation in the scanner, we'll look at your brain, what lights up. Turns out that those areas, dark areas of the brain, light up. It turns out that those areas are all connected in what we now call networks, specific networks that are linked together, that come online when certain things are happening in your brain. And there's a specific network called the default mode network. Has anybody heard of the default mode network? Some people have. So the default mode network is simply areas in your brain that come online when you are either relaxing, you're daydreaming, you're getting into a state where you're ruminating, when you're thinking about yourself. All these areas come online. That's called a default mode network. It seems to be a network important in what's called self-referential processing. It's looking at the world with reference to yourself, right? And so all these areas sort of come online to do that. When folks are doing mindfulness meditation, the default mode network essentially quiets down. Those areas that are activated during self-referential processing sort of quiet down. So that's the power of mindfulness meditation. I would assume is this notion that it's helping you control the areas that are engaged when you start doing rumination and thinking about yourself and how you're relating to others, et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense? Right? Okay. So this is one of the things that science is showing us. Now, the other argument that people make is that perhaps this feeling of being overwhelmed comes from the fact that there's just too much information, right? My mind just can't handle all that information. And I'm going to try to make the argument that that doesn't really quite make sense. So one of the root causes may be that we have too much internal information, right? And when you look at all the organs inside your body and inside your mind, it can be overwhelming because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of things that do the following. Here on the left side, I just put a few things that control your oxygen levels and your glucose levels, that control the levels of neurotransmitters and peptides, that do temperature and respiration regulation, heart rate and blood pressure. They control cholesterol levels, et cetera, right? So there are dozens and dozens of systems in your internal organs that are doing this amazing thing called life. They're keeping you alive, basically, right? And so there's actually what I would call, there's an intelligence behind all that, because something has to coordinate all these systems, right? And on the right side, I put just one of those systems, which is the blood regulation system, that involves things like the liver and the pancreas, and it involves the monitoring blood sugar, and et cetera, et cetera. There's just, within that one system, there are dozens and dozens of other things that must be done in order to maintain your blood sugar regulation at a certain level, right? So imagine that, and then times dozens and dozens of other systems doing other things, and yet something is maintaining you alive, maintaining you in balance, what we call homeostasis, or the intelligence of maintaining balance. And I would argue that when you do mindfulness meditation, there's a sense in which you can begin to get in touch with that intelligence that's controlling those things, that internal environment, right? So that's another aspect of mindfulness meditation. Okay, so the idea is that there's a lot of stuff going on just internally. You're not aware of it, yet something is helping you control it, right? And one of the questions that comes up is, well, I never hear from that. If there's an intelligence, I never hear from it. How do I get in touch with it? Well, it turns out that in fact, that intelligence system is constantly trying to communicate with you. And so the argument is this: a lot of the signals that you get from what we call the interoceptive environment, the internal environment, come in the form of emotions, or signals that come from the internal environment that tell you, hey, there's something happening and you need to pay attention to this, right? So you get thirsty. That's a signal from the internal environment that you need water. Now, most of us will go and drink water, right? As I will do right now, demonstrate. Because I felt thirsty, my internal intelligence said, you need to drink water, so I drank water. You get hungry, you eat, etc., right? So there are really a lot of signals that you get from the internal environment that you respond to, and you respond to them automatically. You don't even think about it. But one of the things that happens is, if you ignore those signals, so let's say you have a headache. Okay, a headache. You ignore it because it's just a headache, right? One of the things that may begin to happen is that other systems get involved in other, there's something going wrong internally, and whatever is going wrong begins to spread, right? So instead of now simply a headache, maybe you begin to feel a pain in the lower back, right? And you still ignore it. And then it gets greater and greater. And so part of what happens is that the signals become louder and louder. The signals that you get from your system become what I would term emotional signals that are telling you there's really something going on in your internal environment that you need to pay attention to and do something about. But now let's go back to Mr. Duffy. Remember Mr. Duffy? Head spinning here, body over here. He's living in this world here. What's happening over here? He's ignoring all this stuff, right? He's ignoring all the signals from the body that are telling him, you got to do something. Something's happening. So if you live too much in your head, that could be one of the consequences. And for me, this became clear in the following article that I read in the New York Times. It came out in January this year. It said, diabetes is fueling an amputation crisis for men in San Antonio. And it caught my attention because I have diabetes. And then it said, well, Latinos, in the Latino community, there's this explosion of amputations going on in San Antonio. And I became really interested because I'm a Latino. I have diabetes, and so I don't want to have an amputation. So I paid attention. It said, there's a lethal combination of genetics, poor access to healthcare, and diets high in processed food that is fueling a diabetes crisis in the Latino communities, especially in Texas. Right? And I said, oh my gosh, what's happening? And then you read the article further and it says, it's only happening in the males and not in the females in the Latino community. Females who have the same genetics, the same poor access to healthcare, the same poor diets, etc., are not experiencing the amputation crises that the males are. And I thought, wait a minute, what explains this? Well, I think what explains it is the fact that males tend to ignore the bodily signals that they get, and they don't go to the doctor, they're too macho to complain, etc. And by the time they're far gone, the only solution is amputation. Whereas females tend to be much more sensitive to those bodily signals. They go to the doctor early on, they get medication, they take care of the problem, they don't get amputated, right? So I thought, oh my gosh, so there's a price to pay when you don't pay attention to your bodily signals for whatever reason. In this case, cultural reasons, gender reasons, for whatever reasons. If you don't pay attention to what your body's trying to tell you, you suffer these consequences. Okay, that's an aside. So, is there too much information going on? Perhaps, in the internal environment, let alone now in the external environment. So all of you are able to see, hear, smell, taste, touch, do all these things that process information from the external environment, right? A massive amount of information is coming in through your senses and you're processing all that. So you add all that to all the internal information, there clearly is a lot of information going on inside of us. The question is this the problem? Well, my argument that it isn't because of the following. When you were young, between the ages of, when you were born to about 2 years of age, you had a similar amount of information coming in. Internally, the same amount of organs were working. Externally, the same sensory input was working, right? And yet, an infant at that age thrives on that kind of information. So here's what we do within the first few years of life, right? We learn to crawl, to walk, to talk, to control our bladders, to feed ourselves, to recognize sounds, to learn a language or two, to manipulate and control the environment, to understand the world, right? Imagine a 2-year-old mind capable of doing that and more in the first 2 years of life, faced with the same amount of information that you're facing. And in fact, for infants, I would argue it's even worse because they haven't categorized things in the world, right? They hear a sound and they don't know what that sound is. They don't know that it's a dog, and whatever. Whereas as adults, we at least have some categories and we can say, oh, well, that's a dog, right? But yet an infant can do so much. And so the question I ask you is, why aren't we able to thrive with that kind of information? You have the same system nowadays as an adult that you had as an infant. Why aren't we able to learn another language or two? Why aren't we able to, learn about new things as readily as we used to, right? Does anybody know why? What is the problem that occurs?
Is it plasticity? When we grow older, that our brain changes?
Our brains do change in plasticity, so your brain is much more plastic at the beginning, and it does get a little less plastic, but it's still very plastic, even in old age, right? We can still learn, right? We learn less because we have so much more information already, right? So that could be part of the problem. Okay, on the right side is a chart that I like. It's a simplified chart, but it makes the point. So you have this environment, right? The external signals that are coming into you, into your internal sense. And then you have your body at the bottom that's also providing the internal signals. And they come together at somewhere in your brain, and the brain can process all this information, right? So when you're very young, all this input is coming in and it's flowing and things are happening and you're learning and, et cetera. What happens to that as we get older is part of it is this thing. That we begin to develop a new mind, if you will, or a new an intellect, an awareness that begins and is capable of reflecting on all this internal and external stuff going on, right? So as we grow older, something emerges in us that is able to look at all that internal and external stuff, and it begins to try to make sense out of it, and it becomes aware of it. And so it's an amazing capability that we begin to develop. And if we could only integrate it well into the system that we were born with, it would be amazing. Unfortunately, it doesn't get integrated very well. And part of it is because it comes into a world that is essentially a very painful, a lot of bad experiences that it gets exposed to. And so instead of reacting to it in a healthy way, it begins to react to things in a very unhealthy way. It begins to try to protect itself from all the violence that it encounters in the world. And we end up developing what we call an unhealthy ego. But the way I see it is an unhealthy ego is just simply the fact that we're not able to integrate that new developing mind into the brain mind that we were born with, right? Because of the following, because of things like fear and anxiety and other factors that create this sense of, I want to protect myself against that world, and so I create this shell called the ego, and which begins to filter things and misinterpret things and so on. And so the internal dynamics, which were flowing very well when you were very young and they were being processed and you were thriving, suddenly you have this thing now sitting here saying, oh, that's not good, that's not bad, I don't want to do it that way, and it's like throwing sand into the mechanism, right? However, there are some individuals who are able to integrate that new sense of mind, integrate it into that brain mind, and we get what we would call a healthy ego, right? So there are individuals, and I don't know if you remember the chart, the normal distribution chart, that on the left side, there's a group on the far left side of what I would call healthy individuals who don't really suffer mental chaos, or at least they don't experience it as much as most people do. They either are able to deal with problems pretty well, it flows through them, etc. And that's what I mean by a healthy, integrated mind. And so I would say the goal, the purpose of mindfulness meditation is to move us in that direction of trying to integrate this thing that we had a problem integrating when we were young, but now as adults, we can look at it again and say, well, maybe I don't need to respond to problems that same way, and I can begin to respond in a healthier way, right? So that's the idea. So there are many problems, but I want to highlight at least 3 significant problems that are associated with mental chaos. So one is this creation of this ego, unhealthy ego, right? That begins to distort our experiences, both internal and external experiences. There's this sense of separation that I talked about, where we're living in our head and ignoring the body. And other things like a reduced connection with others. We're social beings, and when we are living in ourselves most of the time, we tend to ignore others, and so we lose that sense of connection. And so one of the things that I talk about in my book is how do we begin to do something about that? And I talk about something called RUBI, which is a 4-step sort of approach to mental chaos, which the steps are to first recognize what the problem is, right? And by that I mean that you need to recognize that you have an unhealthy ego and that you respond to things in a certain way that may not be optimal, right? And so that's the first step, to recognize that there is a problem with that ego that then distorts how you experience the world, right? Second is to get to this understanding that there's more than problem solving. Problem solving is an amazing thing that humans developed, right? Our mind is capable of solving amazing things, But it's not the only way to solve problems. There are alternatives. And if you spin and spin trying to problem solve something and you're not getting anywhere, maybe you need to try an alternative solution. And so understand that fact that there are alternatives, other mind states that you can access that can give you a different perspective on the problem. And one of them is this mindfulness, open awareness, living in the moment. There are many other things you can try. You can do dancing. You can be a creative writer and do writing. You can focus on cooking. It doesn't really matter. But the reason why I emphasize mindful awareness is because it's one of the easiest things to do. You already know how to do it. All you need to do is just practice it a little bit at a time. You already know how to be present, mindful, aware. And you can be here in this moment if you want to, instead of living in the past or in the future, right? So it's something that you already know how to do. The third thing is to find the right balance. And by that I mean there's problem solving. And so it's not that we want to get rid of problem solving, but we want to find a balance between doing that and doing mindful awareness. You need to know when to do which. Right? Sometimes you need to step back, relax. Sometimes you need to solve a problem, but you need to be aware of when to do that. So finding that balance is important. And then I say that you find your strategies. What is it that works for you? Does doing Tai Chi work for you? Does doing dancing work for you? Does meditation work for you? Once you find a solution, then, implement it and practice and see how it goes, see how it works. So mindful awareness, to me, is a mental superpower that we have that we utilize very little. We're not aware of it and we don't practice it. And so it's just sitting there unused, basically, right? And it's the idea of simply noticing what is happening in this moment, both inside and outside of yourself. How are you feeling right now? Right now as you're sitting, how do you feel? Notice that, be aware of it, be curious about it, and have a non-judging attitude. And that's all it takes. Just be aware of it with a non-judging attitude. That's mindful awareness. And these are things that you can practice at home. Anytime that you're doing anything, washing the dishes, you can say, what am I doing? I'm washing the dishes. How do I feel? I feel this way, and just be there at that moment doing that thing. That's mindful awareness. So these are things that you can practice anytime, 24/7, while you're driving. You don't need to close your eyes, meditate. You just need to be aware of what's happening at that moment to develop that sense of open awareness. And so when you do this, as I've been practicing for 30 years, and so I can tell you that one of the things that happens is there's a growing sense of being able to do that. And what comes with that is this sense of relaxation, that you can call that relaxation at any time during the day, right? So you're beginning to feel stress and you say, okay, step back, relax. It comes into you because you've practiced it, right? There's also this feeling, I don't know if people are familiar with the feeling of flow. Flow is this sort of sense of doing something without really being aware of it and doing it really well. So most athletes, for example, talk about being in flow when they're, playing tennis or shooting baskets, right? They get into the flow of things. Well, it is possible for any of us with this practice to get into that sense of flow as you're going through life. You just feel the sense of things are just flowing, in a very relaxed way. And of course, what comes with that is the last thing there, which is a sense of well-being. And so this is why I feel kind of obligated to let the community know that it's by doing these simple practices, and you don't need to do, an hour a day or whatever, if you do like 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day of just simply being aware and do that over and over and over, that sense of that it grows, right? It grows. And so the sense of well-being also grows. And just to sort of end the last 2 slides, I wanted to show you some data. Now this is kind of dated, but it's been replicated before. And so this is individuals who suffer from anxiety. They were given this thing called the Beck Anxiety Inventory before and then during treatment and then after treatment. So if you look at the left side here, the higher the number, the more anxious an individual is, right? And so for 6 weeks prior to the beginning of treatment, they were assessed and they had very high levels of anxiety, right? They started treatment, meaning they started doing mindfulness meditation, and you can see that immediately there was a decrease in that sense of anxiety down to a very low level, and then the treatment stopped, and you follow those individuals to see how long does it last. Is this an effect that's only there when you're doing the meditation, or does it last? And you can see that post-treatment, it lasts for at least here 20 weeks after they stop meditation, right? So this is the kind of data that science is telling us that this works, right? So here are individuals who suffer from anxiety. They start doing the meditation, their anxiety lowers, they stop the meditation, and that anxiety remains low. Now, they didn't follow them to see if it comes back. It probably does, you know, but then you just practice some more, right? Anyway, it works. And so here's my final slide of what is the importance of this mindfulness meditation to well-being. So one of the things is that it helps you integrate your body and your mind. When you practice being present, you can't help but have your mind where your body is, right? If you're saying, I am here at this moment, your mind comes back into your body, right? You do that over and over. It helps you reintegrate that Mr. Duffy mind that we talked about. So it then strengthens your ability to sense the signals that are coming from your body. It helps reduce the cognitive distortions that the ego is involved in. As I showed you, one of the things that it does, it quiets the default mode network, which we think is the basis for this egoic thinking, right? You quiet that, it helps you reduce that. It provides what's called metacognitive insight. And what this is when you step back and see a problem, it gives you this big picture, right? So rather than being focused on the individual details, you see the big picture. And sometimes an answer can come from seeing that big picture. This is metacognitive insight. And then the last 2 things I didn't really talk a lot about, but it brings greater awareness of our connectedness, and it engages the creative aspects of mind. This is something that I go in the book, I go into a great deal of detail because I'm interested in creativity. And one of the things that I found when I did my own practice was really an increased sense of creativity with this practice, right? Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. And thank you for listening, and we'll open it up to any questions that you might have. Okay.
Your last comment, your increase in creativity, did that lead to your poetry writing?
Yes, that was an outcome of I never thought that I could write poetry. I mean, I was a scientist for 30 years. And you know, science and poetry don't kind of match. But after I retired, this surge of energy just came over me, and it just needed to be expressed. And I felt that writing poetry was the way to express it. That just came over me one day, and I started writing, and it just kind of, things just flowed. So I would say that, yeah, that I felt that sense of energy and creativity.
On that note about creativity, are there any takeaways that come to mind from the book that you could talk about briefly here? Any key things that you found about creativity?
Well, so here's, thank you. Well, creativity is a really complicated topic, so I don't really have time to get into it. There are many aspects of creativity and different ways of measuring creativity, right? And so it gets really complicated. But here's a basic study done by Baas et al. In 2014 showing that after a short practice of mindfulness meditation, individuals were tested and showed greater sense of creativity. Now, in this case, creativity was simply assessed by how many different things can you say about what this is, right? So some people would say, well, that's a water bottle, it's a plastic thing, et cetera. More creative individuals can give you more things to say about that, right? So that's how creativity is judged. In this case, how much more can you say about something? So after mindfulness meditation, individuals were able to say more things about objects than before, right? Yeah.
I was wondering about the monkey mind and then becoming calm. Do you see that at all as like a separation between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the sympathetic nervous system is that system that activates, your heart rate and your blood pressure and things like that. Parasympathetic is the opposite. It takes you down, right? And so there is a sense of when you're meditating that you're more actively activating the parasympathetic nervous system because it's calming things down, right? And so you are engaging that system more, if you will. And the more you practice, the easier it is to engage that. And like I said, at a point where I can be sitting here and start feeling nervous and just call upon that sense that I have from my meditation that says, calm down, and it calms down, right? So this is what I mean by control, that it is possible to gain that sense of control over some of these autonomic, systems, and that's been known for a long time, yeah. So I don't know if that answered your question, but okay, yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how to integrate something like mindfulness into elementary, middle, high schools, since we hear a lot about kids today having high anxiety, mental health crises for young people. So are you seeing that's becoming more part of a curriculum where schools are teaching this at a younger age so these people can grow up to figure out how to cope with?
Well, so let me say something about 15 years ago, if I said the word mindfulness, most people didn't know what that was. Now, probably most of you had already heard that word mindfulness in some context, right? And you knew a little bit about it. There's actually been a revolution in that sense of the need for mindfulness training in society at large, and specifically in schools. And so in the last 15, 20 years, there's actually been an increase in this sense of we need to bring that kind of teaching into high school, into grade school. And there are curricula now where classes are taught teaching kids how to do these kinds of exercises. I'm actually very interested in that, and I am hoping to be able to teach kids meditation and learning to relax. But yeah, there are a lot of schools, and here in San Diego, there are some that provide that curriculum already.
I have two questions. When the vegan and vegetarian diet became became a topic in the mainstream, there was a study called the China study about the data behind the effects of not eating meat, not consuming meat. I'm wondering if there's such studies that that vast amount of people were taken into consideration, let's say, where a society practices majority Buddhism and meditation is actively practiced by majority of people. Is there some sort of study that basically lays this information out in greater numbers? And the second question is unrelated, but related to the topic in general. So what is the biggest hindrance? And you mentioned the ego being in the way of accessing that mindful state. What happens during that 8 weeks of practice? How is the mind dealing with the aspects of the mind dealing with ego, and what kind of relationship takes place?
Okay. I'll take your second question, because the first question, I wasn't quite sure, and I don't know a lot about vegan and dieting and the role of meditation and all that. So, but the second question is really interesting. And I think what you're asking is, what is the biggest hindrance in terms of the ego? So one of the things is, I'm not sitting here advocating that we get rid of the ego. That's the last thing we want to do. The ego is a natural thing that evolves. What I'm arguing for is that we need to integrate it a little bit better. And the biggest hindrance that the ego creates is the idea that people begin to identify with the ideas that come out of that ego, right? So imagine, here's this thing sitting inside of your brain, interpreting the signals and saying, that's too painful, I don't want to deal with it, or this is good and I want that, right? It's doing that kind of thing. You begin to identify with that sense of ego, and you begin to identify more with, okay, I want that, but not that. So the biggest hindrance, I would say, is the idea that we identify with those thoughts that are created by ego, right? Where I would argue that we want to move away from identifying with that ego, because the thoughts that it creates are misinterpretations, they're misjudgments, they're based on false data that it's trying to, protect itself. And so it's giving you false information, fake data, fake data. You don't want to identify with the fake data of the ego, right? And so that's the main issue. And the way you address that is by simply observing the data. So this is the power of awareness that people are not aware of. This is the superpower that you have. By simply observing what's going on in your mind is creating a storm of, doubts and things. But by simply observing it, you reduce the energy in that thing. Just observing it just reduces that energy. And eventually it just fades away, right? You don't have to do anything except observe it. So the power of awareness is just that. You bring it into this field of awareness, and it eliminates the source of its power. So that's how you then get rid of ideas. So you're thinking, oh, I've always been judged as not good enough. So that's an idea that your ego created. Well, just observe it. And every time it comes up, just say, oh, okay, there I go again. I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. Well, there it goes again. I'm not good enough. And little by little, your mind just gets tired of that, and it begins to release that energy, right? So that's part of the process. But of course, it takes time. You got to be dedicated to sitting there and looking at these things going on.
So in like the third wave of behavioral cognitive therapy. They have this acceptance commitment therapy, and a lot of what they say there is similar to this idea of being aware and looking at your feelings and your thoughts, and there's more and more evidence that this is helping people with anxiety and depression and all that. But as you yourself also said, like, problem solving is important, right? Like, and if, like, there's, I guess probably this crisis that you described is happening also because something in the environment is changing. There's more technology, you also referred to it, different technology that manipulates our attention and all that kind of thing. And although, like, observing our thoughts and feelings, being aware of them might help, there's more, right? We need to do something to change how we interact with the environment to solve it. I'm just, my comment is, like, could you comment a little bit about that? Because I don't think it's, if the house is burning, oh, I feel hot, and if I just, oh, I feel hot, it's okay, it's gonna be fine. It might alleviate a little bit, but the house is burning.
You just sit there and
I mean, it's of course I'm exaggerating, but that's the metaphor.
Your house is burning. No, absolutely. No, that's a great question, and that's a misunderstanding of what meditation, and especially mindfulness meditation, is. It isn't that you sit back and let things happen. In fact, you try to do whatever you can, whenever it's the opportunity arises that you can actually do something. If the house is burning and you're able to go put out the fire, then you go put out the fire. If somebody's hurting and you can help them with a blanket or whatever, you give them the blanket. So it isn't just sitting back and and letting the world go its own way. It's really being even more engaged with the world, right? The less that you're devoting your energy to these problems, the ego problems, the more energy you have to actually engage the world in a healthy way. I mean, that's really the consequence of it. And so compassion is something that you don't even have to work at it with mindfulness meditation. You work on the problems, getting rid of that ego, and compassion just comes up, just like the energy of creativity. It just comes up, and there it is. And now you can't help but be compassionate towards others. That's the feeling that you have. Yeah, so it isn't holding back or not doing anything. It's being more engaged, actually.